because there's a bunch of things that are critical to have that team function at a high level, right? You need
Yeah.
people to feel empowered. You need people to feel heard. You want people to identify problems and not feel like they'll be punished for identifying problems.
Yeah. When I first started training new people managers, one of the first things I had to do was figure out what to train them on. When an engineer becomes a people manager, what are the critical skills that they need in order to be successful? And honestly, the first thing that popped into my mind was the ability to build trust. Now, I will admit I was a little uncertain how this would go over, especially working with technical organizations. I'm not sure they would fully buy into the idea that trusting another person is the key thing you need in order to be successful. But luckily, that idea has actually gone over really well, and today's guest is a perfect example of that. Paul Day is the co-founder and VP of engineering at Muon Space, an end-to-end space systems provider that designs, builds, and operates LEO satellite constellations for Earth observation. Previously, Paul led satellite programs at Loft Orbital, Apple's satellite connectivity group, and Skybox Imaging. This is a really amazing discussion in which we dive into why top level individual contributors so often struggle making the transition to becoming a people manager, the importance of a concept that Paul calls organizational EQ, and of course, why building trust is one of the most essential skills for being a people manager. Before we get into the discussion, I do want to remind you that if this is your first time listening to the show, make sure you hit subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you are someone who's responsible for developing leaders in your organization and find today's conversation interesting, I would love to talk to you. Please reach out to me directly, matt@betterradiostudios.com, so we can see if there's a way that we can help your organization build better managers. With that, let's get into the discussion with Paul Day. Paul, thank you so much for being on the Leadership Launchpad. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to speaking with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to chat with you. And the place where I'd like to start, since you have been in kind of the satellite game for a while, I think space satellites in particular have been known to be, really expensive and take a long time to build. With all your experience, I would kind of love to know, what are some of the traditional drivers that make satellites expensive and take a long time? And then what is Muon doing differently to fix that?
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it's a good question. I think it's one I get asked a lot when we try
Yeah,
to define what we or what the new space industry is doing differently. And I think if you look historically, a lot of and it was fundamentally driven by launch costs for a while, for
that's
one
true.
reason.
Yeah.
Um, where everything was, you needed to eke out every iota of performance that you could get out of the solution that you were going to put in space. It was going to cost, a lot of money to put it up there. You need a lot of capability. And it drove you towards these very custom, very optimized designs around that specific task, right? To get every last bit of performance. And I think, in short, where that tends to drive you is kind of where you would expect, right? It tends you custom engineering solutions, you're custom building sensing systems, you're custom building power systems to give you every bit that you can get, and that basically that custom and typically a higher level complexity drives you down this road, both on the production side where you're highly custom. So you have to produce very small, if not one-off production runs of these very highly custom solutions.
Yeah.
All this infrastructure and test is set up ad hoc. All that takes time. And then there's the typical complexity that's in there too, which even when you get through your production, your build, you get into the test and the verification and validation of this system. Um, and it becomes, again, a complex system requires complex validation and verification to make sure what you actually need to do. You're going to be able to meet that complex mission on orbit. And that just it complicates and extends every aspect of the spacecraft production, build, and test program, and that leads to those very, very long lead times.
Yeah. So how are you trying to tackle that? Because I know, at Muon, I think that's part of what you're trying to do, right? Is make that a lot simpler and easier.
It is, and there's a number of ways to try to tackle this, and I think that the easiest one that you'd probably hear the most is sort of modularization, right? Using
Hmm.
off the shelf components, and I think I generally agree with that. I think there's multiple ways you can attack that problem as well, and I think one of the ones that we've tried to do is really sort of a focus on vertical integration wherever we can,
Yeah.
because fundamentally, one of our theses is that the integration of these systems is the hardest part,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
it's where it's not just to be flippant. You buy a camera, you stick it on a bus, you put in a USB cable, tighten some bolts, and send it to space, right? The integration, especially on more and higher performance Earth observation systems, which is the area that we've focused in,
Yeah.
can be insidiously complex and problematic when you try to bring these complex systems together. And
Yeah.
that drove us, in the direction of vertical integration, because what we wanted, is to really have total control over the architecture that we were building to meet the customer's needs. And in some cases, we have customers bring instruments to us that's their IP or something they've procured. And in other cases, we actually do the design in house to create like a higher performance end-to-end system, because we have control over all these aspects of the chain, whether it's the bus, the instrument, or otherwise. So, I mean, there's myriad advantages to vertical integration. It is a higher NRE investment for sure, so that's something
Hmm.
that is a downside. But what you get, you get to choose your own architecture, right? And to us, that's critical to achieve that a higher degree of ease of integration. And what I mean by that is, when you are in control of all your, the architecture of your hardware, and the architecture of your software, it allows you to take advantage of a lot of different sort of more modern components, modern techniques, modern software approaches. That give you tremendous advantages when you need to do that end-to-end integration and the
Yeah.
validation. And I
Yeah.
think it requires a lot of effort, right? I think the other advantage is, like, when you put in that effort, what you get is um, an ability to go sort of increase the level of performance that you can achieve with that system. You're not beholden to, hey, whatever you get is as good as the vendor offers, right?
Yeah.
You're not
Yeah.
you're not beholden to the choices or architectural choices they've made, either hardware or software, maybe 5 years ago, God forbid, 10 years ago. Um, you can build an in-house system that's higher performance. So the fact that it's modular, right? The downside of modularity, right, is that you build one, it's a jack of all trades, a master of none, right? You do
Yeah.
sacrifice some amount of performance by backing off from that hyper optimized solution. But we can make up for that by designing our own system with cutting edge parts that we've
Oh, okay.
validated and screened ourselves from a radiation perspective, thermal perspective, et cetera. We could get closer to that sort of optimized point, but
Yeah.
not having to sacrifice the modularity that allows it to more easily integrate with customer A, customer B, customer C. So we found that that's given us like a solid advantage in terms of how we approach the problem.
That makes sense. So you're kind of trying to take advantage take the advantages of both worlds, where to kind of cancel out some at least some of the trade-offs that you have with those two approaches. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
the only other plug I'll say is, like, I'm a hardware guy. Don't get me wrong, but I think one of the advantages you get when you control that hardware architecture is it allows you to implement a software architecture of your choosing.
Yeah.
And in my experience, software is always the long pole.
It's true.
One good hardware engineer can keep many good software engineers busy for a long time. They tend to be the long pole. And so allowing you to make software architecture choices that allow you to accelerate your development process and your test process can be
Yeah.
enormously advantageous, and is something, again, you may not be able to achieve. You're likely not going to be able to achieve if again you're beholden to the choices that have been made by your vendors or suppliers.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting in my experience looking around and talking to different companies, just how much hardware companies rely on good software, and even to the point of view of just like like the manufacturing process software. I mean, I think like Stoke Space, they made their own. Well, obviously, SpaceX made their own kind of internal system for managing everything. Stoke Space loved theirs so much that they actually sell it as a SaaS product, the kind of like on the side of building a rocket company,
Really.
which is
I
which
didn't
is
actually I
interesting.
didn't actually know that. I should reach out and see what they're pitching down there because I couldn't agree more. That infrastructure software that goes alongside what you're building is
Yeah.
also critical and can be critically enabling. I mean, man, we could do a whole additional show on just
Yeah.
that and the state
Yeah.
of the industry there and how to do it because that's one of the things I care a lot about and I like to nerd
Yeah.
out about in terms of how we're going to scale our production here at Muon.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean Laura Crabtree, she's a friend of mine and former guest. Her company Epsilon 3, that's what they do. She left SpaceX and started just kind of like that software management company.
Yeah, we're
Um,
a customer.
oh, excellent,
Yeah.
fantastic. So you're doing a lot of this custom stuff. You're making but you're making it modular. There's a lot of technical challenges to that, both on the hardware side and as we just said on the software side. So you have a lot of engineering talent, shifting to a little bit more of kind of like the subject of what we talked about and what you and I talked about earlier, is that means you have a lot of this really high engineering talent. And then as you build a company, you ideally want to be shifting some of that talent up the ranks into leading that engineering talent. And I've seen that traditionally can be a hard shift to make. What are some of the challenges that you've seen in your experience leading these highly technical teams? What are some of the challenges that engineers face when they're making that initial shift into being a people manager?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because it is a really challenging transition for a lot of engineers, and I think as we discussed before, there's a couple books that I think get it pretty right, and I'm not paid by these, no plug here.
Yeah.
One of them says it a lot in the title. It's called "What Got You Here Won't Get You There," and it kind of
Yeah.
lists out a lot of like typical pitfalls, bad habits. There's another one called "The Next Level" when it talks about habits to pick up, habits to put down and I think what what I see in a lot of engineers is they're pretty good with the pickup, right? Most engineers are analytical. They're aware of their shortcomings or they're aware of what they don't know, right? So they know that hey, okay, I'm going to need some new skills. So maybe I'll get a book. Maybe I'll go think about management techniques and how to do these. But oftentimes, what I feel like the critical part is that's not as clear is what to put down, right? What to stop doing. And
Mm.
many engineers, right? They're in this position of getting promoted into management. They're typically the top IC, right? That's the usual process. Okay, who's the top performer in Group X? All right, we need a manager of Group X. It should be that top performer. And I think a lot of what ends up happening is those tendencies that make them exceptional individual contributors can complicate that transition into management. Um,
Yes.
One is sort of this. They typically have a very high standard for their individual contributor work, right? That's most engineers, right?
Yeah.
We tend to be perfectionists, and
Engineers like to engineer.
exactly, right? And they strive for that level of perfection. And I think what's difficult is to understand a little bit more about, from an organizational perspective, for team perspective, um, the practical reality is perfection is not required across all fronts, right? And
Yeah.
knowing how to identify, how to determine when something is good enough, right? When something that may not be up to their individual contributor standards, I would have done this better. This isn't how I would have done it. When that is still good enough for what the team needs or what the company needs, that can be challenging, right? Because that's a
Yeah.
judgment call, often a judgment call they're not accustomed to having made, right? They're responsible for their own output. They kept it at their high standard that got them this position to begin with. Um, and I think that can be challenging because what it leads to can be a very prescriptive approach with implementation strategy, like how like a you know dictating to their new
Yeah.
reports how things should be done, and it comes across as it's my way is the only way. This is the
Yep.
best way that something should be done, and that doesn't tend to build an environment of empowerment and
Yeah.
ownership in those reports. Um, and the one other thing that I feel like I've seen fairly commonly is it is one has typically exceptional visibility over their individual contributor work, right? Everything that's going on, right? you've
Yeah.
got you've got it pegged. You're controlling the variables, you're working with it, you're pulling things together. And what happens when you go from being on Team X to leading Team X is that visibility starts to fade a little bit, right? It's not quite as
Mm-hmm.
clear. A little bit of the fog of war creeps in.
Yep.
Everyone's busy. You don't have that visibility across everything anymore. And what it leads many high performing ICs to do is to sort of develop this sort of innate anxiety, right? Like I used to know
Mm.
everything that was going on, and now I don't.
Yeah.
It makes me
Yeah.
nervous. What if something goes wrong on my watch? So it leads, that and the previous thing I mentioned kind of lead towards this like over statusing, being sort of invasive
Yep.
with updates and
Yep.
visibility. I need to see everything that you're doing,
Yep.
and I think both of those contribute, to a sort of tendency towards micromanagement, which will brush if you have exceptional team members that you're now managing. They'll
Mm-hmm.
bristle at that,
Yep.
and it can also lead to kind of overextension, where okay, hey, you did, team member, you did your job. It's great. It's probably good enough. But I'm just going to polish this up a little bit, or I'm going to fix this, or I'm
Yeah.
going to work on this a bit, and so there's this tendency to overextend because now they're doing five semi partial individual contributor jobs as well as
Yeah.
their management job, and
Yeah.
that can lead to burnout, overextension, and things like that.
Yeah.
So this is some of the common things that I've seen or witnessed, that I think are driven by those common engineer tendencies, which I think as at an IC level are great kind of habits to have.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you put that so well. I had never really thought about that before because I've always had this kind of sense that almost the higher you go in an organization, or really like kind of the farther you go in your life, in some sense, is dictated by kind of like how much uncertainty you're willing to live with. That like how much you're comfortable with, in a sense, because as you said, like that, the more layers there are between you and the actual work, kind of the more opaque that becomes, the more the fog of war is there. And it's just, I do think there's a tendency to think it's a problem to be solved when really it's just kind of a reality that has to be accepted, at a certain level. There's some amount of like you need to know information, but you have to find that right level so that you're not constantly in the weeds, and getting overwhelmed. I did want to ask kind of a follow up to that idea of my way is the right way, or like always want it to be better. Do you also see that sometimes it's not just that you have this really high standard of work and people maybe aren't meeting that and you want to raise it, but you're used to like it's my way, and do you see people struggle adjusting, like somebody just doing it different? Maybe it's even better than what you have done, but it's just they're doing it differently than would have been your first thing. Is that a challenge you see, or do engineers tend to like be so focused on kind of like the results that they're able to get past that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm hesitant to be too broad in
Sure.
my assessment,
100%.
but I do think
Yes. Yes.
many engineers often become creatures of habit, right? So
Mm.
they're whether it's the programming language they use. I mean, boy, how
Mm.
many engineer to engineer programming language arguments have you seen in your day about, oh, use Python, no, you use this, no, use Julia, do you use that Rust, or um, that's funny, but I do think that is one inhibitor to, I think, accepting these alternative approaches, is
Yeah.
that tendency over time. And many engineers have been through a long series of education to get where they are, and then their
Mm-hmm.
professional experience. They do become creatures um, of habit. I think that's one of the big contributors to it. I'm trying to think. there's there's others as well. It's kind of
Sure.
eluding me at the moment, but
That's okay.
I think that's
Yeah.
that tendency is a big one, and it
Yeah.
takes time to really adjust and for them to be. Um, you know what? I think the one thing else that I'll volunteer is many engineers, especially the ones again those top individual contributors, um, when presented with a problem, I mean, I'm guilty of it. I'm sure many you and many of your listeners maybe, you get presented with a problem, and there's this sort of like 30-second crank turning, and then like snap judgment, like, huh, I bet we could do it this way, right?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
there's almost this like recency bias towards those initial snap assessments, and of course,
Yeah.
different experiences, different backgrounds, exposure to different engineering disciplines could lead one to,
Mm.
to take very different approaches in those initial snap adjustments or
Mm-hmm.
snap assessments. And I think that just common psychological bias towards one's guess, I think
Yeah.
can create a barrier almost instantaneously on presentation with a problem like that can be
Yeah.
difficult for folks to get over without sort of forcing them to take a more open mind, and listen to what others, their subordinates, their peers, or otherwise might propose.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's 100% right. So yeah, so you've done an amazing job of kind of highlighting some of the major challenges, especially for those really high end individual contributors when they make that shift and the implications that it can have. Maybe starting with that one, since you said like sometimes you cause that snap judgment. I think a big thing then as you make the shift is figuring out ways to stop yourself from doing all that stuff.
Mhm.
So like, I mean, I guess starting with that one, since you say sometimes you have that snap judgment, how have you kind of trained yourself to, I don't know, do you stop that? Do you suspend judgment? Do you like what do you do to kind of overcome that challenge?
Yeah, it's I mean, that's a great question, and I imagine everyone's going to have to sort of develop their own approaches to this
Yeah,
themselves.
absolutely.
Um, but I think part of it starts with humility, to be
Mm,
honest. I think I did 10 years of engineering education. I did my graduate work at Stanford, um, and I think one of the things when I got there was this sort of exposure to some really really brilliant, absolutely
yeah.
brilliant people, and going through my experience there. It was humbling, right? Like you're everyone there is high performing, and then you get there and you look around and you find some folks you're like, oh my god,
Yeah.
these folks are next level, right?
Yeah.
I've had the fortune of working with many of those folks over my
Yeah.
career, but I think for me one of the things it did is instill a little bit of the knowing what you don't know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And recognizing that, hey, expertise exists outside of me, that is greater than mine, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's key. And even for people who really are those top tier achievers, I think this one has to be introspective and kind of force themselves to say like, hey, even if it's reading a bit of psychology and things like that, and understanding the way that human tendencies in their brains, I guess things like recency bias and other things, being aware of that, I think that's to me that's like the engineer's solution, right? Is let me understand the system
Yeah.
that's operating
Yeah.
between the ears, and let me
Yeah.
understand some of these natural biases, so I can kind of spot them and feel them, and
Yep.
and I think what that leads to, I mean, a little dose of humble pie never hurt anyone, never hurt any engineer, but just and I think also appreciating the fact that if you've done your job right, or at least if your previous job boss has done your job right, hopefully you have some pretty solid folks around you, right?
Yeah.
And that diversity of experiences, again, exposure to different disciplines, exposure to different programming languages and trades, I think can be really key uh, to the realization that there's always multiple ways to attack a problem, and that other ways can often be as good, if not better, if you open your mind to it and force yourself into a very engineer like rational assessment of
Yeah.
these approaches.
Yeah. Yeah, I know exactly the experience you're talking about of, I always kind of joke with my wife of that. Like, I know smart people, and I'm not one of them. Like, I always think back to. I mean, and I think pretty highly of myself, but I think back to when I was at the Air Force Academy getting a physics degree, and it was like the top member of the physics department, so he's got a 4.0 in physics, and oh, by the way, he's like building his own car on the weekend. Kind of, you're like,
Yeah,
okay, man, that's
yeah,
go you.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know the type. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's tough, especially I think for new managers, because there is that humility piece. But I think the other thing that I often see is a challenge is there's a little bit of imposter syndrome that can be there as well. And so people are, even though a part of them knows and believes that like, other people have great ideas that I need to, pull from. There's also this belief that I'm the leader now and I'm here because I'm supposed to have the answers. So I'm going to like overemphasize the fact that like I'm the one making the decisions, or I have to come in and make the final say or have the good ideas, because like that's my definition of what a leader is. From your perspective, especially focusing in on frontline leaders, what do you think is the primary role of a frontline manager, especially in a company like Muon?
Yeah, I like that question. I do want to key in for a second though on something you just said, sort of that
Yeah.
tendency, I'm the leader now. Let me establish myself as a leader. I do think that's important, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, to me, there's this balance. There's obviously the IQ, right? And most engineers generally tend to be pretty high IQ. There's also
Mm-hmm.
the EQ, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I might get bad comments or shot for saying this, but like I've known a lot of engineers. I was in engineering school for 10 years. We generally, engineers have a tendency a little bit more towards the IQ than the EQ.
Sure. Yeah.
Not a statement across the board,
Yeah.
uh, but I think that there's the EQ, which is important to the people manager role. And I also think there's this counterpart to that, which is almost like an operational or organizational EQ. And
Interesting.
I think there, to me, those two things are critical. I'm going to assume, for the sake now, you're the top IC, you're a smart person, you got the high IQ locked down. Um, the EQ side, right? You do need to know and have a feel for how to deal with people. Even when you're managing other engineers,
Yeah.
humans are inherently irrational. I mean, we see that in
Yeah.
every way, shape, and form in our daily lives.
Yeah.
Um, and I think engineers are more rational than most, but can still succumb to human tendencies towards irrationality when it comes to, their perception, their title, their role, their pay, everything like that. And I think inability to engage with them and engage in a discussion there that isn't simply explaining to one that they are being irrational doesn't tend to go over terribly well. Kind of state that,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
an ability to engage in there is critical for one to be able to work with the spectrum of people they have. They may have engineers that are just like them, highly rational, and not overly emotional per se,
Yeah.
or prone to outbursts. But they will inherently have a spectrum, and they must be able to impedance match to each of those and enable to adjust their approach and style for those interpersonal reactions,
Yeah.
which I think is key. But to address a little bit more what you said, there's this counterpart, it's like again, operational EQ, which is how one goes about establishing themselves as that leader, right? Because there's a bunch of things that are critical to have that team function at a high level, right? You need
Yeah.
people to feel empowered. You need people to feel heard. You want people to identify problems and not feel like they'll be, you know, um, punished for identifying problems.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a very delicate balance to establishing that. And that, to me, that's the operational EQ, which is, hey, how do I make people feel heard, but
Mm.
avoid analysis paralysis, right? Avoid
Mm-hmm.
opening every decision up to the council of elders or the full team, or
Mm-hmm.
when is enough debate enough, and we need to make a
Mm-hmm.
decision. And that that is not. I don't think it comes naturally. Certainly not to everyone, but I think it's also a
Mm-hmm.
skill and an awareness that is honed over time. And
Yeah.
I think you can be successful as an individual contributor engineer without building that muscle up very much,
Yes.
because if you're not aware of it, right? It's easy to overlook when you're in a fairly well-run meeting, um,
Yes.
like what it takes, when to know to draw that line, where to where to stop asking questions and make a decision. It's easy to overlook, and that takes practice and to get good at it. And again, you can be very successful as an IC without building that muscle, and then it leaves you wanting, and you can go in very different directions when one tries to go do exactly what you said and establish themselves as a leader. Um, and if without that balance and practice, you can end up again the analysis paralysis end of the spectrum, where everything's a constant debate and decisions are never made, or you end up in the dictatorial end, where it's just like, nope, I slam my fist on the table. This is the way we're doing it, and both of which are going to be problematic in very different ways
Yeah.
when you go to try to actually lead the team and continue keeping the team at a productive operational cadence.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that because normally when you think of EQ, we primarily think of it on a personal basis, like a one-to-one basis. And so
Yeah,
it's transitioning that of like what's the overall feel of the whether it's your team or the organization and just kind of like how those dynamics play out. That you're saying like that's a wholly other like kind of key skill to kind of develop.
yeah, yeah, it is. And I
Yeah.
I honestly think, I mean, the pure EQ feels a little bit more personality based and
Yep.
naturally driven. Not to say that one can't improve their ability intentionally, but I feel like the operational EQ, to some extent, has to be learned, has to be experience
Yeah.
based, and you have to be aware of it, to try to pick up on the good habits and the bad habits. Right, like we've all been in a really bad meeting that went nowhere and accomplished
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
But looking at those good meetings, what sort of intentional approaches were taken to result in the outcome that you want, and also the sort of the feeling among the participants that, hey, this is a good decision. Whether I agree with it or not, I'm going to commit to it. I was heard. I feel good about this. I feel good about this company that I work for.
Yeah. So it sounds like kind of went around to a couple different things, but with that idea of like the primary role of a frontline leader, especially, is that kind of a big part of how you see it? Is being that person who can manage and balance and understand that kind of organizational EQ to make the best outcome, so for the whole team.
It is, and I'm trying to think of, if these kind of things are nuanced. It's a bit difficult
Yeah.
to kind of boil down to certain things, but um, using myself as an example, and to be clear, not to claim that my way is the only way to do this effectively, but one of the ways that I've found to be successful is like the old motto that you've heard a million times. It probably feels a bit trite, but lead by example. Never ask anyone to do something that you wouldn't be willing to do yourself,
Yep.
if push came to shove, right?
Yep.
Sometimes people ask me what we look for at Muon, what kind of people we want, and I mean that's a difficult question to answer, right? But I kind of jokingly will respond sometimes like, we're looking for people that are willing to take out the trash, and I kind of get these like puzzled looks, and I was like, let me give you an example.
Yes.
I was like, we got a facility back in 2021. Recology wasn't showing up on time. I was trying to set
Yes.
up everything. Trash was piling up. We had a dumpster, right? And I was like, I was the co-founder, chief operating officer at the time. Like, I took out the trash. I broke
Yeah.
down boxes. I ended up dumpster diving when contractors filled the recycling up with styrofoam because I knew Recology would yell at us. And it's just like we want people that will do whatever it takes to be successful and are willing to do it themselves. Because I think when
Yeah.
people see that, um, you know, uh, they see that that big starts to become the culture, right? There's
Yeah.
like no not my job culture. Um,
Yes.
and I think the other, this is a bit further afield from, I think, that sort of organizational EQ, but hopefully that concept was at least a little bit clear. I think also holding oneself to your own standards, right? If you are
Mm.
going to, I think about this the other day. We're in the process of scaling up a lot of our production, and it's more important, for example, that more of our engineers understand um, inventory and kitting processes, right? Why it's
Mm.
important
Yeah.
that you can't just go take a part off the inventory
Yep.
shelf, and why we're structured about kits that go into assemblies that go onto flight spacecraft that get consumed into
Yep.
an as-built bill of materials. And so we've had trainings and things like that. And
Mm-hmm.
I showed up to the training and like sat through the training and understood it and everything like that. And afterwards, some folks came by. I was like, hey, like I appreciate that you actually showed up, like to the training. And I was like, hey, this is important to me. I'm the one
Mm-hmm.
preaching this. Like, what would it look like if
Mm-hmm.
I didn't show up to the training? Right?
Yeah.
Generally, yeah, I knew most of the material, but it's about like again living it. Like, if you're going to say it's important, show it's important.
Yeah.
And I think that's what will get people to feel like it's less of lip service and more like, okay, hey, this is actually how we're going to operate.
Yeah.
Um, we're all gonna live by the rules. We're all gonna operate in this in this style because it's important to our success as the company. Um,
Yeah.
the other one I think would be like trust and empowerment. You know, you you will not be able to be successful as a leader if you do not trust your team, and that if you don't trust your team, you have the wrong team, right? And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
if you have good people, you need to trust them. All right, to,
Yeah.
to speak to that, I don't know what's going on everywhere all the time. The fog of war is the fog of war, right? This it doesn't magically lift through special through special skills or different
Mm-hmm.
techniques or an IT system like a Jira or
Yeah.
whatever else. Like
The
there
tool
will
won't do
be,
it.
yeah, right. There will be the fog of war, and I think if you have to become comfortable with that, and you have to say, you
Yeah.
know what, I trust this person, right?
Yeah.
If I trust that they're going to handle their job, and if they need help, they're going to ask for it, and I am going to create an environment where they feel that they have the ability to go do that job. They have the ability to make localized decisions as long as they understand sort of when the impacts of those decisions may require more, escalation or moving them up the
Yep.
chain. That's a nuanced thing. Heck, we could probably spend a whole additional episode
Yeah.
on just that right there.
Yes.
Um, but also, having them know that you have their back, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm the manager of this team. The buck will stop with me, right? I'm giving you this trust because based on a relationship, based on your capabilities, based on what I know you can do, um, you know, I'm going to let you operate. Things will go wrong. Things will go wrong, and when they go wrong, I will have your back, right? The only thing I will ask of you is to be able to provide me with like why you thought this was the right idea at the right time, why you thought this was the right call, why you thought you had the authority to make a decision. And if that makes sense, right, that's that trust, right? I trust you to
Yep.
make rational, informed, responsible professional decisions. Then I have your back, right? And it stops with me.
Yeah.
And we will fix this together. This is not something where I'm going to throw you under the bus or blame. And when you can, it's not easy, right? Because it really does require a willingness to put oneself at risk based on
Yeah.
that trust of that
Yeah.
team,
Yeah.
um, and one's own reputation. But again, hire the right people makes it a little easier to do that. But once you establish that relationship, that's when things start happening by themselves. The production increases, and to me,
Yeah.
that's when start to become successful and your impact will grow well beyond the maybe 1.2x your IC, 1.5x if you're kind of micromanaging and overextending yourself. Your impact grows significantly,
Yeah.
and all of a sudden your day-to-day impact can be integer multiples of what you could do as an IC because you're enabling and empowering those folks to go execute independently.
Yeah. I mean, I obviously agree that trust is essential. Trust is the first kind of like foundational skill that we teach at Better Everyday Studios when we're working with new leaders. And probably one of the things that come probably one of the reasons that I kind of like focus on that so much is, you mentioned hiring well, and I come from a military background, and whenever I'm talking to people in the business, I'm always like, what would you do if you had no say of who was on your team? if people just showed up one day, and that's who you had to work with, because that's every leader
Yeah,
in the military,
yeah, that's
right?
great perspective. Yeah,
And it's all about building connection, building trust. How do we work with these people? Because you don't have any say in who's coming in, and so you
yeah,
just have to develop techniques to build it.
yeah, and I have to imagine that requires different strokes for different folks, right? You can't
Yeah,
manage that very diverse team uh,
yeah,
in the same way every time. I mean, I'm sure there
yeah,
has to be consistent structure. It's the military, but
yeah,
yeah, it requires, I would imagine, just a very different, to go back to to nerdy term like impedance matching, right? You
yeah.
have
I
to
love it.
know how to adjust to connect with and empower different people, and to me, it's maybe a smaller, a more limited subset of that problem on the engineering side, right? Because you do get a little bit of pick and choose, and they all have a similar
Yeah,
background and maybe a
yeah,
foundational understanding of things. But yeah, no, it's a great point.
yeah. Well, this has been awesome, Paul. To kind of close out, are there any what's the next big milestone for Muon? What are you all looking forward to right now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I would say you probably haven't seen it, right? But I've got our cool T-shirt, Firesat Zero.
Awesome.
We have a launch coming up on the next transporter. It is an internal mission, Muon owned, but it is the prototype, the first of its kind of what will be a really transformational wildfire detection and tracking
Yeah,
satellite constellation. So we're really excited about getting the first light data from that, understanding the instrument
it's
performance.
awesome.
Um, our partners at the Earthfire Alliance are really excited about that, and there's a lot of additional potential for use of this data in many different verticals. So, and it's the first of our new sort of second generation satellite design with deployable solar and lots of other cool bells and whistles. So it's on the rocket now, and our ops
Great.
team is busy prepping. We're really excited about that. I can't say the specific date because I don't know when it will be. It's moved a little bit
Yeah,
recently,
yeah.
but it's in the very near future, and we're excited about that. So definitely check out our website, our socials, and stuff if you're at all interested in the program, either the prototype or the broader production program.
Awesome. Well, that's definitely exciting. So definitely look forward to that. This has been a great conversation, Paul. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, no, it was an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.